structure at 314 8th Street Northeast, 1030 6th Avenue Southwest, acquired through the involuntary acquisition program for the flood control projects.
So moved.
Motion by Alderman Walsky to approve.
Second.
Second by Alderman Olson. And Alderman Walsky, you said that Alderman Straight had forwarded a question.
He did, and I apologize, Mayor, but my comment would have been much more appropriate had I pulled item 7.6 instead of 7.13. But I'll simply just share the comment because I think it can be captured very quickly as attached to demolitions, which was that Alderman Straight, I chatted with him briefly this afternoon, and he had expressed a concern over some of our demolition sites where the home is removed, but the basement or the pit is left sitting and standing in some cases for, I think there's an example down off Central Avenue where it's maybe been about a month that we've had an open basement. And so I think he just wanted to bring that to the attention that it has caught his eye as something to be concerned about, and would like to see better attention paid to the circumstances of our demolition contracts.
City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Alderman Walsky, for bringing that to my attention. We'll definitely look at it. It is our attempt to try to close off basements as soon as possible, keep them from becoming a safety hazard. So I'll get with the staff after the meeting tonight and make sure that gets addressed.
Further discussion on 7.13. Seeing none, please call the roll.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
Yes.
Olson?
Yes.
Pittner?
Yes.
Padragula?
Yes.
Motion is approved, and this is where we're going to take a short detour back to our city manager's report, as apparently our network is back up. Yes, I know, and everyone is very excited. And we'll turn things back over to our city manager here for his full report. Tom, did you take the clicker with you?
I did not. I've got to grab that. It looks like I'm already losing audience members.
Oh. We will get back to our regularly scheduled agenda here in just a moment. For those folks at home or maybe on social media, we had skipped over the city manager's report number 4 on our agenda due to network issues. It is back up and running. So, Mr. City Manager, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I apologize. We all get used to working on network drives and the cloud and all of those fun things. And then, of course, when the connections get severed, you can't access or even pull information to then put on a thumb drive and advance it some other place. So I appreciate our IT staff getting this up online here. And I'm pleased to give you this month's city manager's report. Here are the important dates to remember, several along the way. Probably the most important one, aside from the next city council meeting and the planning commission, is Halloween. So that's on October 31st, of course. But we have chamber meetings, the annual chamber event that's on October 16th, the annual meeting there, and then the council meeting on the 21st, planning commission on the 28th. So one other thing you'll want to be aware of, I'll put this up in the presentation a little bit later in the evening. The Main Street Summit will be held in Bismarck on the 29th, 30th, and 31st of October. So you'll want to be thinking about that. We have several staff, and I think some of you have expressed interest in going as well. We'll start first with construction updates, and as everyone knows, it has been raining like crazy. I think we've got 8 inches or so of rain for the month of September. That has created a heck of a problem for not just the harvest, but also for our construction activities all across the city. And it's created lots of different delays in regards to construction. And currently, we're about 2 to 3 weeks behind due to weather on phase 1 of the flood control project. We'd hoped to have 3rd Street open sooner than the end of the month, but with the delays, that's going to push the opening of 3rd Street a little bit longer. The contractor is now having to mitigate for wet soil. We can't get compaction and proper soil approval from the engineers, the geotechnical engineers, so we're going to have to amend soils and those sorts of things. Of course, that costs money and takes time, and that's also adding to the delays as well. But we have tried to maintain pedestrian accesses throughout the project. We don't see that changing at this point in time either. For phase 2 and 3, the flood walls and pump station work continues, underground utility work continues. There's really not been too much of a change from the last month's report, other than things are progressing, but a little bit more slowly because of the rain. 16th will continue to be head-to-head through October as well. That was another road that we tried to open up a little bit sooner, but that's just not going to happen given the delay with the weather. The Broadway maintenance project, similar story here. We'd hoped to be all the way Moving on, we've had a lot of things that have been fun and exciting over this last month. One of them was the Sister City visit. We did have a delegation of 8 Norwegians that came over officially as part of the delegation to meet with us. And this was an opportunity for us to get together not only with the delegation, but also with the other partners to the Sister City Agreement. And that includes the Minot Area Development Corporation, Minot State University, the public schools, Høstfest, and then, of course, the City of Cheyenne representatives. So with that, here were the representatives that visited us, mostly for the public's viewing pleasure. We had a current council member and also former mayor of the City of Cheyenne, the former city manager of Cheyenne, a leader of the School and Cultural Board, a trade and industry department head for the City of Cheyenne, and an advisor to the school administration that also came as well, in addition to a couple others that visited. This was pretty exciting for us. When we were, the mayor and I, in Cheyenne in May, we knew that the election was going to occur in September this year for the city, and it wasn't certain that anyone would be able to come over. So we were delighted to find out that we had 8 folks come over, so we're really pleased about that. We had a number of things that we did with the delegation while they were here, including a variety of different types of tours, the official reception and dinner. We had the Sister City Business Meeting, Governor's Dinner and Reception, commemoration to Sondre Norheim. We had a 5-hour business meeting that we didn't expect. I think we kind of thought that would take an hour to an hour and a half, but there was so much information exchanged and so many opportunities that were brought up that the meeting had to be scheduled a few times, actually, in order to get all that work done. School tours and meetings, tours of the Air Force Base, agriculture and ranch tours, Høstfest, I mean, the list goes on. It was all packed into about 5 short days during their visit. They were extremely gracious and are looking very forward to coming back next year as well. Let's move on to the census. I just wanted to sort of advise the council and the community that we have a census complete count committee. It's been established for several months now. The work of the committee is progressing nicely. Alderman Olson will probably give you an update on the liaison reports in 2 weeks at the next city council meeting. But essentially the goal of the committee is to have every single citizen counted. We believe we're pretty close to the 50,000 person threshold. Of course, that's a big number for us. I've mentioned that before because that means that we would become eligible for entitlement funds from the Community Development Block Grant Program of the federal government, and that could potentially give us anywhere between $300,000 and $400,000 of entitlement money every year in our budget thereafter. So that's pretty important. There are a lot of activities that the committee is working on, including marketing campaigns and advertising campaigns. And I wanted to just put a plug out for our citizens who might have a little downtime and want to get involved in this. The census is currently hiring enumerators as well as other positions throughout our region. And of course, they're not bad paying jobs. So if you're interested, you want to go to the federal website and log on and give them your information. We will also be pushing very hard the online portion of the census registration because the more people we can get registered online, the less time and expense we'll have sending enumerators around house to house to house to try to get those folks that didn't submit their information online. A couple quick updates on the NDR, National Disaster Resiliency Program. The first one is housing. The multifamily low to moderate income housing project known as the Milton Young Towers improvements is progressing. The authority is reviewing the engineering request for proposal, and we hope to make a final decision later this month. Also, the single-family low to moderate income resilient homebuyer program, we anticipate about 7 gap financing closings in total by mid-October, which is pretty exciting for us, seeing that this is just kind of continuing to gain momentum as we go. The City Hall project, we have a massive review of documents that are being undertaken for 2 buildings in our downtown. We're looking at technical memorandum. We're looking at environmental information that's available. We're doing essentially records research right now. And that's in thanks to our city engineer who's leading this effort with his team. And we do hope that we'll have a collection of all this information to be put into a technical summary that then we can bring back to the City Council and help provide information that will lead us to the next decision-making step in the City Hall project, which is, sort of what to do next with this information and where possibly to go and what the options are available to us. On the buyout program, areas 6 and 6A, which you recently approved, just wanted to let you know we're sending general information notices this month, and we do intend to have a neighborhood meeting. I think that was important to either Alderman Wolski or Alderman Straight. I can't remember which. So we have made adjustments in our acquisitions process and are being attentive to that. The Center for Technical Education portion of the NDR program continues. We have identified a couple of Trinity buildings, and I have spoken with the CEO of Trinity, who is open to exploring the potential for those buildings to be used, or one of those buildings to be used for the Center for Technical Education. So the two college presidents have taken it upon themselves to go and tour the building or buildings that they're interested in, and we're just awaiting word back as to whether or not that one or more of those buildings might work, and to kind of figure out a game plan going forward after we pull the team back together. On the downtown gathering space, I won't go into too much detail because, of course, this is an agenda item on tonight's City Council agenda, and there will be much more information shared during that presentation. So I'll just kind of glaze over this pretty quickly. Site 2 property negotiations deadline was September 30th. We had 9 total properties that you might recall. 2 of those properties were city properties on Site 2, and 7 were private. 4 of the 7 private owners do not want to sell. 2 were based on price. They just couldn't get an agreement with the city on price, and 2 just didn't want to sell. Cost reasonableness has been a big concern for the city. The initial assessed value of Site 2 was $890,000. The value of all the private properties in what they requested for purchase price was more than twice that, $1.78 million. And so that doesn't include the added costs of demolition of the sites, relocation of tenants, and site preparation costs, which would still need to be added to the 1.78. So you'll hear more about cost reasonableness as Mr. Zakian comes up and makes his presentation, but that is an enormous hurdle for us because it is one of the requirements under the infamous HUD rules. Lastly, the technical committee met on October 1st because it was important to me that the committee meet right after the September 30th deadline and discuss all of the issues and concerns associated with the gathering space, particularly auditing the process, looking at the entire negotiating timeline, and evaluating the cost reasonableness concerns that I've just discussed. I can tell you that our consultancy, EM Smith, when asked directly, is there any stone that has not been overturned in trying to make Site 2 work? The response was that every effort has been made to reach agreement with all property owners. The committee did debate all of the information that was presented in almost a 2-hour meeting, and then unanimously recommended to move forward to the next location. You'll hear a lot more about that here in just a minute, but just for the purpose of the quick overview in the city manager's report, I thought I would give you that. Next up, the Buy Local Task Force has met. We have agreed that we will try to get our work complete in about 2 months' time. So we hope that by December 1st, we'll be able to start working on a recommendation, if not pull together the final comments in the recommendation and present that at the first meeting in December to the City Council. There's been excellent dialogue with the team from the Chamber and also the city team. There's been some recognition of some limitations of this work. For example, a quick exercise that we did in the task force was to identify some of the limitations associated with the procurement policies that we have to follow based upon the source of money that we're using. For example, the federal government has a different set of rules when you use their money than does the state, than does the city. So we have to make sure that a buy local ordinance works as well as it can with all 3 of those different procurement guidelines. And if it doesn't, we want to try to figure out the best fit for trying to make this work. One of the exercises that we did was to evaluate how much money is sort of at stake here. If you look at the city's recently adopted 2020 fiscal year budget, that was a $275 million budget. Of the $275 million, and these are back of the envelope numbers, so don't get, they're not very precise, but we've estimated about $80 million of that is actual local money. So you might say, well, the other difference is state and federal money, so we might not be able to use the same type of buy local preference that has been entertained here. But the problem is that we leverage quite a bit our local money with state and federal money. And of course, as soon as you use $1 of the state or the federal money, now the entire amount, including the local amount, has to comply with either those state procurement or those federal procurement rules and laws. So we've got our work cut out for us to try to figure out exactly how we're going to make something like this work. But the team is energized and excited, and we're going to see if we can't do the best we can given the time that we have. The Nuisance Properties Task Force has met a few times. We're calling it now the Problem Properties Unit, which sounds kind of exciting. You don't want to be on this list. Essentially, this list is the problem properties we have in the city that are taking an excruciating amount of time to bring into compliance and are costing the city time and resources in doing just that. So recalcitrant properties, essentially. Those that continue to repeat zoning violations or code violations or other sorts of violations. So essentially, we have convened this team of internal and external stakeholders and leaders to attempt to try to identify these properties and identify why these properties continue to be problematic, and to make recommendations for how we can bring them into compliance and then further keep them into compliance as well. So that's the work of this particular team. There'll be more to come as the team gets further along in its work, but I think this is pretty important, and given the fact that there's been added emphasis on the need to bring these types of properties into compliance sooner, I think the timing for this committee has actually been quite good. Next up, Community Engagement Focus Group. This work continues. Essentially, we are in the middle, actually we're near the end, of the work for the focus group. The focus group has met for the last time, and now the staff are reviewing the final comments of the focus group and are making revisions, and we'll send that out for one last review. Then we'll meet with the department heads, and we'll talk with them about what's in this engagement strategy and how they can contribute to it, both its improvement and its implementation. Then, of course, we'll bring all that to you for your consideration. The goal here, again, is to ensure that when we need to engage with our citizens, that we do it in a clear and a timely manner, and that we are consistent on all fronts with regard to our intentions to engage and get feedback to make our programs, plans, projects, and services improved. Next up, I want to talk about a couple operational improvement updates. We have a couple of different performance improvement teams. I think I've mentioned these to you in the past. The employee improvement teams, which is working on recruitment improvements and staff onboarding. Those are two huge components of the staff improvement component of our operation. The recruitment improvements meetings have occurred probably 3 or 4 times right now, and have had to be placed on hold just briefly while we got the last final push of the budget through. And then we got through the Sister Cities events. Now we're going to pick that work back up and hopefully bring that to a close here in the next couple of weeks to 6 weeks or so. Staff onboarding, we're in the research and data collection phase. This is important because we know that based on the research that staff make their decision to stay in an organization. These are national statistics, by the way. Within about 70% of all staff make their decision to stay in an organization within the first 6 months of joining that organization. So it is really important that once we hire somebody, that we do everything in our that's possible to keep them in the organization. And there are a lot of things that we're missing right now in our organization to help them make that transition smoothly and to be to set them up for success early in their short time with the city. The Finance Improvements team, as you already know, has been making significant progress on advancing the ERP software implementation projects. We have 3 components of that. We're going to be upgrading our financial system software, our asset management system software, which is what Alderman Padragula had mentioned a little bit earlier in regard to collecting statistics and the use of assets and equipment and materials and those sorts of things. And then lastly, the building permit and development component. All of these things will be started, as Alderman Padragula mentioned, this year. But it will be a long time before they're actually online and ready to use. It will be at least probably 12 months before some of these will be fully developed implemented, tested, and ready to be brought online. We are upgrading from the 20th century to the 21st century, and that's going to take us a lot of time. But I'm very excited, and I want to thank all of you council members for your support in helping us to update these very antiquated systems and to give us the type of data that will help us make better decisions going forward. Next up, other operational updates. We have two other improvement teams. One of them is the operational improvement team, which is looking at our permitting processes and trying to streamline those processes both in time and assure that permit fees actually cover costs. We've done some of this work already. You've seen that come to you in the form of building permit revisions, or permit fee rather revisions. That was approved. We appreciate that. We'll continue to look at other costs of services and make sure that our fees cover those costs of services. And we'll be researching centralized purchasing options to also help improve over current processes. Customer improvements team is including the community engagement process and improvements, particularly the engagement strategy that I just mentioned, as well as the customer service standards and training. The standards and training are something that our Human Resources Department is working on and working toward. We've got customer service training that's already started, and we're continuing to expand on that, and we appreciate also your support in that realm too. Moving forward, the team has been asked and encouraged to learn about and begin developing key performance indicators. This is going to be important work for us as we communicate with you, the City Council, on how we are doing on a performance basis on a certain period, particularly yearly or annually basis. So we want to improve our knowledge and understanding of our operational systems. We do that by collecting data, defining and measuring and analyzing that data, and then making the improvements, and then researching how well those improvements are, and then repeating the cycle again. This will allow us to become more data-driven and allow us to make better decisions and adaptively manage all of our work for desired results. So some departments are ahead of others, but all departments are making nice progress and moving forward on this front. It's my hope that we'll be able to bring the preliminary key performance indicators to you sometime first of the year. Okay, we do have to analyze what data is available to us, what it means, how important it is, the frequency and timing of the data release, and what we're going to use as it relates to targets, whether it's going to be arbitrary targets or benchmarks or industry standards or those kinds of things. So there's a lot to sort of figure out here. The team's doing a nice job making progress on that front. As was said a little bit earlier in the presentation, or excuse me, council meeting tonight, we are preparing for snow. Our forecast looks like this for the week. We're going to go essentially from summer/fall immediately to winter in a matter of just a few days. We are preparing for that, and I wanted to tell you a little bit more about that. Actually, the forecast looks more like this. We do expect snow beginning essentially Wednesday, and of course Thursday, 3 to 6 inches have been predicted. Friday as well with snow, and then kind of moving into Saturday as well. Now, we don't know if this is going to stick around, if this is the start of winter. We think maybe it's not, but nevertheless, it can create, of course, as you know, headaches and road traveling conditions. This is our snow plan. We decided to put it in a graphic just so everybody, it was easy to read, everybody knows kind of what to do. So everybody's got their role, right? No, actually, we do not want this to be the case. This is not the City of Minot snow plan, so I thought I'd share with you what the snow plan actually looks like. Essentially, crews are dispatched prior to large events to pre-treat the streets. And essentially, we will do sanding events when we expect snow under 3 inches. So we'll go out and sand, in some cases, maybe salt, if we have freezing rain and those kinds of things. Graders are dispatched at about 3 to 4 inches and anything greater than that. The crews will run 24 hours a day. And the snow gates will be used, but everyone needs to keep in mind they only work between about 6 to 10 inches of snow. We get anything more than that, even 10 inches is pushing it. We get anything more than that, and the snow gates just simply don't work. So we do the best that we can with, but the snow event really is what helps dictate whether or not the snow gate's going to be effective. The type of equipment that we have 8 motor graders, 3 truck plows, 3 front-end loaders, 4 skid steers, 7 truck-mounted sanders, with 2 brine tanks, and then 2 snow blowers mounted on the front front-end loaders. We have 2 foremen, 16 heavy equipment, and 13 light equipment operators as well. They work around the clock until the snow is removed. It generally takes us about 72 hours to get the entire city cleared of all of what you see on the screen in front of you. We do have a priority. This is all outlined in the snow plan. The staff are educated about the snow plan each and every winter season. And essentially, we start with the snow routes. We have about 30 of those inside the city. Then we hit the school areas and the adjacent streets in and around the school areas. Residential and the central business district are then hit next. In the residential, during the day, we try to hit 2 graders to cover 3 or 4 quadrants at a time. And then the central business district is where we're working at night, of course, trying to keep them open for the next day's business. And then, of course, after all of that, we work on sidewalks. And sometimes we can get to sidewalks if we have additional crew or whatnot a little bit more in advance. And we try to get, there's been more emphasis placed now on key sidewalk corridors as well. This is probably a good time to remind the public that we do have an ordinance that requires people to remove snow from their sidewalks, whether they are in the right-of-way or on their personal property. So that's important. We are, as you all know, going to probably be increasing enforcement. We've had a lot more pressure lately, a lot more complaints that have come in, and we'll have an extra code enforcement officer that will be helping us with this starting January. So, well, they won't be hired by January, but we're going to be recruiting for them in January. Okay. Current status for this week. We have the street department watching the weather, and they're going to be monitoring for sand events because we don't expect a ton of snow. The sanders are ready to go today. We already have 2 graders that are outfitted and ready to go with cutting edges. And then our leased machines are being prepared. And as well, the salt sand mix is ready to go as well, sitting in the covered shed as well. So roads will be cleared, but our gates just aren't ready on the equipment yet. So if we do have an event over this next 3, 4, 5 days, we won't be using the snow gates because they're not quite ready. But they'll be put on here pretty quick. So snow communications, we do intend to continue to get a lot of information out on the snow removal plan as well as operations. There are going to be 12 social media posts. We've already got those scheduled. Videos including how the snow gates work and how sand helps the streets for traction and whatnot. Those are already developed and will be issued. We're going to send out alerts. And as well, I wanted to remind the community that we do have a razor tracking system. So you can go online to this website address and you can pull up exactly where any of the graders or other snowplow equipment is located. And you can see when they've come through your neighborhood or where they are in regards to other neighborhoods and all that kind of stuff. And this has been excellent for us because we get a lot of complaints about folks that say, well, you haven't been by. We can pull this information up and sort of see what's going on inside the system. So that's been good. Again, using data to help drive better decision making. A couple of really quick final words here. The APWA, American Public Works Association, nationally has given the Downtown Revitalization Project the Project of the Year award for this year. It's actually quite outstanding. This is a huge honor for the city, and it's a huge honor for the engineers, including our city engineer and our consulting engineers on this particular project. Our project was a $30 million project, and it rated and competed exceptionally well in the project category from $25 to $75 million in value. So we were absolutely excited to win this. This does make the 5th award for that particular project, which is quite exciting for us. Speaking of other awards, the library is doing quite well, and it won the North Dakota Library Association's Library Champion Award for 2018, which is quite exciting. They are also celebrating volunteers this month, or last month, I should say. There have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours that have been donated to the Minot Public Library in the form of volunteer hours. And we did recognize at this particular event 2 long-time volunteers, Donald Tank and Carol Stolt, who retired from their service at the library, but they put in more than 1,000 hours over a couple of decades of service to the Minot Public Library. And if you consider now that based on independent sector, which evaluates the value of hourly volunteers, that has been estimated about or $25.43 per hour. So you just take that dollar amount, you add it times or multiply it times the number of hours, you can see just how much of an impact these volunteers have on our organization. So we're very, very grateful to them as well. Main Street Summit coming up again, I mentioned at the start of the presentation. This is scheduled for October 29th and 31st. It was excellent 2 years ago when it first started, and the lineup looks exceptionally exciting as well. I would invite anyone who's interested in improving downtown, including the Downtown Business and Professional Association, business owners, city council members, anyone for that matter. This is a summit that you don't want to miss. And I appreciate that our governor has given this quite a bit of time and attention and has lately put a lot of resources to the Main Street Initiative. So this is going to be an exciting summit for everybody. Lastly, I just want to put a plug in for the next city council meeting. You all know that in 2 weeks we'll be back here again, and one of the big topics of discussion is going to be what to do about recycling in the city of Minot. So we have been placing social media posts and doing advertising and marketing to try to get people aware of and interested and engaged about this particular issue, because we want them to show up at the next city council meeting and tell you, our city council, what they think as it relates to recycling. And there are two extremes and everything in between as it relates to the recycling options for the city. So our Deputy Public Works Director is going to be here as well, giving a presentation to talk to you about the recycling options. We'll stand for questions, and then we'll have a nice long conversation about sort of what the direction of the city is for recycling going forward. That's all I had for you. I told you it was a doozy. Thanks for your time and patience. A lot going on lately. I'll stand for any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. I do want to also acknowledge that we do have Alderman Janser and Alderman Straight now that our network is back up and working. If we could, Alderman Janser and Alderman Straight, if you could just acknowledge that you're on the line. I will take that as a yes. Thank you, gentlemen. Do we have any questions for our City Manager? Alderman Patagula.
Just really a couple comments. I guess, first of all, to again say how impressed I am with what you and your management team are doing in terms of improving the quality of data gathering, decision-making, operations, and generally management of the city. And the people at the table here, I think they have the longest perspective on how the city government has operated in 21 years now. And this is markedly different and markedly better than it was back then, and we continue to improve. So I'm very, very excited. As I've said before, I think the new software systems will make a huge difference and present real opportunities for going, as the expression goes, to the next step, the next level. So this is really, really big stuff that's going on here from my perspective. On the more specific side, I like the fact that you're briefing us and the public on the plans for the snow season. The one thing I guess I would urge us to pay attention to is I know we have priorities and everything, is the width of the main thoroughfares, particularly 16th Street and Broadway. They're done, I think, in my opinion, well in terms of an initial pass. But the thing that I'm concerned about, and the only real complaint I have actually, is in terms of the lanes being narrower than normal. And when you're driving 40 miles an hour up a hill and all of a sudden you go from 2 lanes to 1.5 lanes, it's potentially very problematic. So I would ask the city staff and you to pay particular attention. I don't think we have to do this with all the streets. Certainly we don't. But the main thoroughfares, I think in highly traveled and high-speed areas, we really need to have opened up to, full lanes very quickly, or else, limit them to 2 lanes. But I think the going back and forth is problematic. So that's the only complaint I have at this point, and the only strong suggestion I have for you. Otherwise, what I'm hearing is music to my ears.
Thank you.
Further questions or comments for our City Manager? Alderman Pittner.
Maybe just a comment. Thank you, Mayor. Maybe just a comment, maybe something that was missed in the report. It is citywide cleanup this week. And remember to put your stuff out on the front curb, not in the alley. Just some details to that, because I've found myself cleaning out the garage and finding plenty of things I thought I needed that I don't, so.
Thank you, Alderman Pittner, and you can find all that information on our website, which is minotnd.org, if you haven't seen that already. So, further questions? Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
And with that, we go back to our regularly scheduled agenda. We are into section number 8, and that is our action items. The first is 8.1, the Central Ramp Lease Agreement. The DBPA has utilized space to store promotional material in storage at the parking ramps. This lease specifies the terms of the agreement as well as payments for the lease. The recommendation is that the City Council approve a lease agreement with the Downtown Business and Professionals Association for a lease of storage space in the central parking ramp designated within the items that are attached. Alderman Pontegula.
Move that.
Motion to approve, second by Alderman Pittner. Discussion. Alderman Pontegula.
It's finally good to see us trying to generate some income from the ramps, even if it's just renting out them as storage units to people in the area downtown. I presume that we will be getting an update in the next month or two, or maybe a little bit longer, as to how the ramp situation is going. I guess the one thing that I'm, again, noticing, I was traveling a bit last month, and I noticed that some of the cities, all of the cities I visited, had very nice signs saying public parking, a big P and an arrow. And, I know it's been mentioned in the past, but if we could have just an update in the next month or two about, what the status of our improvement projects is. Also, I had the chance to examine one of the ramps, and security issue continues to be, I think, significant. I'm struck by the contrast, for example, between Minot State's campus, where these blue lights and cameras all over the place, and the current lack of cameras, or at least I couldn't see any. They must be very cleverly hidden if they're there. I did see the signs saying you're on candid camera or a security camera. But if we could have just a quick update, also, I guess the percentage of usage, several people have asked about that, and, I know it's a long uphill struggle, but if we could just get a kind of a snapshot in the next month or two as to what's going on, particularly in those areas, I'd appreciate it.
Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. May. Thank you for your questions, Alderman Padrigulo. I can give you probably a pretty good update, and then we'll add to it over the next month. But essentially, the two roof construction projects, the temporary roofs that are going to go on top of the parking ramps, we expect to have those done by end of year. We are already making progress on that. We have bid out security cameras for both buildings. I think we have something like 26 to 30 different cameras that we have spec'd out. We've developed a camera layout plan. We've also spec'd out the equipment, where the lines may need to run inside the garages as well. And staff have also been given the assignment to develop signs for the parking garages that make them a little bit more visible, particularly something that protrudes from the building that you could see while you're driving by, as opposed to being flat or flush on the building. So those are also projects that are underway as well. I can get you more specific information about all of that. We will be wrapping up the bid component of the camera project here pretty quickly, and I imagine you'll be able to see that as well fairly soon on the City Council agenda at some point.
That's
Hopefully
great. Thank
that
you.
provides some additional information.
Further questions about 8.1 on the lease agreement? And for anyone at home, I would only make the recommendation that there is an attached lease, as well as any further information that we're referring to is in the commercial space that is essentially not developed at this point until those roofs are put on and things move forward within the litigation. Seeing no further questions or comments, Kelly, please call the roll to approve.
Padrigulo.
Yes.
Straight.
Yes.
Wolski.
Yes.
Sitma.
Yes.
Janser. Janser.
Yes. Yes.
Olson.
Yes.
Pittner.
Yes.
Motion is approved. 8.2 is the lease renewal for Laverne Mickelson. The attached memo outlines the history of property owned and or rented by the Mickelsons. After reviewing the history of the cropland damage and the cash rent paid by the Mickelson, staff recommends the extension of the amendments to the cash farm lease for another 5-year period. Staff will also hire a firm to conduct a study during this period to try to assess what amount of leakage may be attributed to the lagoon wetlands. Funds have also been budgeted in the 19 and 20 budget for this type of study. The recommendation for approval of the land rent extension with Laverne Mickelson and authorize the mayor to sign the agreement on behalf of the city.
Move approval.
Motion by Alderman Olson to approve. Is there a second?
Yes, I'll second.
Second.
Second by Alderman Padragula. Discussion on the motion to approve. Any discussion? Alderman Wolski.
Mayor Sitma, in reading through the memo and the history, there's a lot to keep track of here, but I'll share that I'm glad to hear that we're going to take a closer look at the larger circumstance and evaluate the appropriateness of this arrangement into the future.
Further discussion? Seeing none, please call the roll.
Olson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Quadrigula,
Yes.
Straight,
Yes.
Wolski,
Yes.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser.
Yes.
Motion is approved. That takes us to the last item within our action items, Gathering Space Project. The deadline set by the City Council of September 30th, 2019 to reach the purchase price agreement with all Site Number 2 property owners expired with no such agreements with all property owners. The Gathering Space Technical Review Team did meet October 1, 2019. The committee has served to review and make the recommendations to the City Council on key matters affecting the project. The committee deliberated on all options, exploring likelihood of feasibility, timeline, scopes of work involved in the related matters. The recommendation to the City Council of the Gathering Space Technical Review Committee is that the City Council commence the acquisition process for Site Number 1 to locate the gathering space. Is there a motion?
Move approval.
Motion by Alderman Pittner.
Second.
Second by Alderman Olson. Discussion, I would look to Alderman Pittner perhaps first for being part of the technical review team.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, we had a meeting last week to reconvene the technical committee. We, with our advisor CDM Smith, with myself, with Nerzakian, Alderman Straight was in attendance. I think we've just hit a roadblock or a hurdle that we can't overcome as a city with the restrictions that we have, with some of the items that we have to consider with this project. Obviously, some of the items were highlighted in the meeting that were just the disparity in price, what the city is willing to pay and what certain property owners may be asking for is just not feasible. The cost reasonableness dilemma seems to be the big sticking point, I think, for the technical committee as well, is that if we go down this road and we were to somehow reach an agreement with the property owners at a price requested of $1.78 million when the original offering price or assessed purchase price would be $890,000, HUD would have a problem with that. That would therefore say you have an alternative that is less, you have to go that route. That seems to be the big sticking point, that even if we were to accept offers as countered, we would still have to move sites. That to me is again, why I am supportive of this project moving forward to move to the next site. I voiced my concerns with this project during the technical committee meeting that I think we're running out of time. I know it's still a ways away. The September 30th, 2022 is still a ways away, but I don't want our backs to be up against the wall. I don't think this council wants our backs to be up against the wall before we lose our negotiating power on either this site or future sites or this project at all. So again, I don't want to be rushed into designing this, into planning this, into negotiating this, any factor. So I think it's time to just accept that we weren't able to come to an agreement on this site, and it's time to move forward.
Thank you for that recap there, Alderman Pittner. Further discussion from the council on the motion.
Mr. Mayor, can I ask a question?
Alderman Straight.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, at the technical committee meeting, City Manager Barry asked our city appraiser, Mr. Turnus, to pencil out a rough number on what the Site 1 tax assessed value might be. And I'm wondering if he had maybe penciled that out a little more in fine detail for us about what that number might look like as we consider moving forward here.
Thank you, Alderman Straight. We'll look to our city assessor, Mr. Turnus here.
Mr. Mayor, at this point, it is basically what we had indicated at the meeting, I believe, 830, something like that.
830, that was the number that
That's
was.
our best estimate at this point
Okay,
for the site on Broadway.
for the site on Broadway. Okay. Alderman Straight, were you able to hear that?
Yeah, so is that the 830,000 plus the 10% that was included for above market value as was used in the Site 2 negotiations? Just so I'm correct.
I have Mr. Zakian, who is coming to the podium here to further detail that, I believe. Mr. Zakian.
Mayor Sitma. Nope, it's on. Mayor Sitma, Alderman Straight. The answer is no. In this case, we would not factor in the 10%. If you recall, the HUD written guidance, which was given to us 6 years ago, basically said that if your assessed value for a property reflects prior years, based on the number of prior years, you can do a percentage range. In this case, if this is agreed to move forward, then we will formally ask the city assessor to do a current assessed value as if this property were taxed, so therefore it would be 2019 values. So the approximately $830,000 figure will be the offer price, or whatever he ultimately comes up with.
Thank you, Mr. Zakian. Can I ask one more question, Mr. Mayor?
Alderman Straight, please go ahead.
It's actually directed at you, sir. I'm curious, as we've kind of made it through the process to this point, do you have any indication, have you had any discussions with the Trinity folks, Mr. Kutch, or the Trinity board on feasibility? I know that they are in the midst of their big project, and I'm just curious if you have any sense if one way or another, if we're going to be able to move forward with this on a timely manner, are we going to have to maybe audible again to look at Site 3?
Mr. Zakian, I think the overall question is if we approach Trinity to take a look at any of that piece at this point.
Mayor Sitma, Alderman Straight, no. Under the rules, we can't go to we can't make any formal approach to the next property owner until we conclude that the current negotiations we're working on. But to anticipate another question might be asked, if this were to be approved today, then the first step would be to make a formal inquiry to Trinity as to whether or not they are still willing to listen to the potential of selling the property for the gathering space.
Roger. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Alderman Straight. Any further questions here for Mr. Zakian while we have him at the podium regarding the motion? Alderman Wolski.
Mr. Mayor, I have a few questions here. Among the first one was, right off the bat, Alderman covered it, which is Trinity willing to sell? So I'm appreciative to hear that, if ultimately this moves forward, that's what we're going to do first, because it would be, I'm glad to hear that we aren't going to conduct an environmental review or something like that. Obviously there's a lot changed in the last 30 months since initial discussions with Trinity took place. Second question, John, you might be able to answer this, and I'll just read these, and for any appropriate parties to answer that might be fine. But provided we get into an environmental review process, Trinity is willing to sell, are we aware of, have we discovered that on the existing site number 1, there formerly was a laundromat and dry cleaning service there? I'm aware of that particular business model providing complications for environmental reviews. And John, I'll just keep going with this and you can address these all at the end. I have a concern about cost reasonableness because that is our justification between Site 2 and Site 1 in terms of one of the reasons why we cannot proceed with negotiations. I'm wondering if we're going to hit that same roadblock between Site 1 and Site 3. As I did a cursory review of the assessed value of Site 3, it's valued at considerably less than Site 1. So, once again, are we going to run into this hurdle where HUD is going to simply demand that we find the less affordable or the less costly location and move there? I have a question about the total budget. If we go back to August 5th in our meeting, we had some citizens raise a concern that the total budget of approximately $6 million, even if we did not use any of it for acquisitions, might not be adequate to complete the project in terms of the representations we've made. Mr. Barry, you shared that same concern with me a couple weeks ago in a meeting. If that is a concern that still exists, then I'm looking, I think, for an approach as to how we're going to address that moving forward. And that's something I'd like to see sooner rather than later. Let's just put it that way. And then as a final question, we had, going back to about middle of August, we had an alternative approach to this brought to us. It was emailed to Mr. Zakian, Mr. Barry, the members of the council. It was essentially a funding swap concept that would move the development of the gathering space project to sales tax funds and take sales tax funds that were earmarked toward flood protection and acquisitions and essentially just flip the projects. As I understood it, the impact to the citizens was basically just a funding swap, but perhaps one of the advantages was we gain a little more local control of the gathering space project, so no additional costs. I have yet to see a response to that particular proposal. I'm curious if that is a viable alternative. And if it gets us a little more control over this project such that we have a better opportunity to realize the larger vision. So those are the questions I have at this point. If we get to the point where we're taking a vote, I might have some follow-up comments.
Mr. Zakian, I think 4 of them. We'll start with the laundry service and other potential environmental review possibilities.
Mayor Sitma, Alderman Wolski, all good questions. I've heard rumors about historic uses on all 3 of these sites. The first thing that we do when we initiate the environmental review will be to do a deep dive historical review on each site and what the history of the uses on that site are. If there was at any spot in Site 1 a dry cleaner, we will catch that early on in the process, and we will then do a deeper dive in terms of assessing whether or not any mitigation occurred, when it was, when it happened. It'll all be part of the environmental process. If during the environmental process a yellow flag or a red flag pops up, it'll be earlier in the process rather than later. And again, I'll be able to come back to you as the council and advise you. And either there'll be mitigation that will be acceptable to HUD, or we may recommend moving on to the next site. It's all part of the process.
Cost reasonableness, an issue with Site 1.
Cost reasonableness, and City Manager Barry noted this quickly in his report. It takes into account all aspects, not just the purchase price, although that is a critical. Yes, there is a disparity, potential disparity between the current assessed value of Site 3, which is approximately about $230,000 to $250,000, and the current estimated value of $800,000 for Site 1. If that stays that way, and remember that we're going to have minimal, we have no relocation costs, and we're going to have minimal demolition costs. I am comfortable, unless it gets too much further apart, just as I questioned you about Site 2. Right now, I'm comfortable, based on what is current, that we can do a benefit cost analysis that will meet the test that HUD would accept. I will be very frank and upfront, just like I was in Site 2. If we start veering much higher in acquisition, then that may become a problem. But right now, I do not see that as a problem. But again, who knows what will happen if and when we get into negotiations. But again, it's a good question.
Number 3, regarding the budget, is it adequate to finish the entire project?
Mayor Sitma, Alderman Wolski, I wish I could give you a yes or no. but we've actually discussed this going way, way back, almost back to the beginning. I have to rely on my predecessors that were involved in this. If you recall, when HUD notified the city that they were going to get $74.3 million instead of more than double that, which is what the city had requested, HUD gave the city the choice of downsizing or eliminating projects. The city, did due diligence, city staff, city personnel, in support with CDM Smith, who also then was their subject matter experts. And they went back to HUD and said, we believe that $6 million is sufficient to do this project. I have to work off of that. I would say to you two things to kind of quantify it. And one, until we actually have a site that will then allow us to do a design, we actually do not know what the ultimate costs are going to be. And secondly, bear in mind that the use of this site and how it is constructed and what is part of that construction has been and will continue to be determined strictly by public input. So for instance, if Site 1 were to become the site, we would then, just as we had previously, we would have at least one or two, probably at least two, public input meetings, get a sense of what they're looking for, take that information and incorporate that into the framework for a design. And then we will determine whether or not we have sufficient costs. Or actually, we can determine that we can provide a gathering space that will really be a contributing force to the downtown within the available budget. I will tell you that there are gathering spaces of similar sizes that have come in the area of $6 to $8 million. There are other gathering spaces of similar size that have come in at 10 to 12 or $15 million. It all depends on what you want to put in it, how much construction activity you want to do, and what your ultimate uses are. But as we stand here today, I am not uncomfortable that we have sufficient money to do the gathering space that the public deserves and wants.
Number 4, and there's going to be a piece that I'm going to add on, Mr. Zakian, was regarding the funding swap proposal that had been brought forward.
Mayor Sidma, Alderman Wolski, some of this is outside, in fairness, is outside of my purview, and I would defer to the city manager and the finance director. I will tell you that there had been a rumor, not among the members of the council, but out in the community, that we need a lot more money to complete the NDR portion of the acquisitions, and that's not true. We may end up needing maybe, based on current tracking, we're still on target, but we may end up needing somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 moved from another bucket, but it's not significant. So in the context of just meeting the NDR applications, the swap would not solve any urgent need. Can we do a swap? Sure, because remember, we have estimated that there is, even with all the funds we currently have, at a minimum, there is probably a $35 million worth of acquisitions still need to be done going forward, all the way to the end of all the projects as projected. But again, it's not required to make sure we're compliant with NDR. We're at the edge in transferring money. We are at the edge of potentially triggering a substantial amendment for the NDR, and it's the way HUD works. So the rules for what triggers substantial amendment are different for NDR than for allocations 2 and allocation 1. We do have more flexibility. If you recall, for allocation 1 or allocation 2, if you move $1 million or more, you trigger a substantial amendment. It's more open. It's a higher threshold, but it's also conditioned on what you're moving it from, what you're moving it to. I'd have to do a real deep dive, but I would say it's likely that would trigger a substantial amendment. And that would end up with 6 months, again, conservatively, before we could use that money, but that would be the way it is. In terms of, a city policy, I that's really outside my bailiwick.
Mr. Zakian, and I do want to follow up part of this with just perhaps a little bit of political insight in part of that proposal, as well as taking a look at sales tax revenues as a potential source. And certainly those sales tax revenues are or could be there, whether it be from flood control or property tax buy down or from infrastructure improvement. What I would strongly caution against, specifically if we were going to take a look at anything flood control related where any of those sales tax are either in the coffers, which we know we don't have enough, or any future of the percentages of those allocations at this point, is we're working towards a significant piece of legislation in the upcoming legislative session regarding a long-term low-interest loan through the Legacy Fund. Significant conversations were had about that down at the North Dakota League of Cities meetings just a couple of weeks ago. And certainly the maneuvering that has to go forward on that heavily involves Minot, heavily involves Fargo, and a lot of other communities that have major infrastructure projects. Certainly the Water Topics Committee would also, and I'm going to tiptoe along this line, not to try to point out or put words in anybody else's mouth, but this would be significant if we were to divert dollars away from what our flood control is to what our need is then for assistance, whether it be on the state or on the even federal level. Then there are a number of other senators and representatives who are watching very carefully of what we're doing in terms of how much we're allocating, which mechanism it's coming through, and then moving forward, whether it be the legislation that we're looking for or future allocations from the state for what has been guaranteed to us through some previous legislation. But certainly if we start diverting money away from our need of flood control, it's going to set a very, very, very bad precedence for us politically. And we do have to look at the broader state issue, even though potentially moving this stuff around maybe towards acquisitions might work for that, but that isn't necessarily our flood control, and there's where the majority of our costs lie. So that's where my substantial caution falls into it, and I can see where some folks could look at this as just a swap, but there's really more to it than that. That's the end of my kind of political discussion on at least from my perspective. Any further questions or follow-ups, Alderman Walsky, for Mr. Zakian?
Mayor Sim, if I could.
Please.
One other item on this, without going too deep into the weeds. If consideration were given to move this money, remember that we're under an obligation to spend a minimum of 51% of the funds on benefiting low and moderate income residents. As we've currently structured our NDR piece of the acquisition, we have qualified an area to meet the LMI standards so that we are currently tracking at about 60% expenditure rate, which is comfortable for us, meaning meeting LMI obligations. Unfortunately, if a decision were made to move this $6 million over and we had to do a substantial amendment, how to approve the substantial amendment, it's highly likely that we cannot use that $6 million in another area to qualify that as LMI. So we could spend the money, but it might become much more at risk or much closer to whether or not we're tracking at 51%. Right now, we're in good shape. If we had to spend that $6 million and we couldn't qualify that as LMI expenditures, that might be a challenge for us going forward. I just thought I'd also bring that out there as a consideration.
Thank you, John. Further questions for Mr. Zakian? Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Further discussion on the motion? Alderman Walsky.
Mr. Mayor, I appreciate the answers to the questions. No surprise, ultimately, I'm not going to be particularly not supportive of this motion tonight. And I'm only going to make a couple brief arguments here. One of the things that concerns me, and it did come up at the technical review meeting, is the opportunity cost associated with the various sites. I look at site number 1 as one of the most developable lots in Minot. Its location on Broadway and in the heart of the Central Business District probably places it in line with among the most valuable properties in town in terms of just vacant land. And so I think in terms of tying that particular parcel up into a non-revenue generating parcel is a mistake. And as I look down to the north of Broadway and I looked at the block at Central and Broadway and I did a quick valuation of what a developed block in that area is worth and the revenue it returns to the city. That entire block that includes Bremer Brank, very similarly sized, has an assessed value of around $6.6 million and is returning approximately $116,000 to the taxpayers on an annual basis. Right now, site number 1 is not delivering any revenue to the city. It's currently used as parking support of Trinity's nonprofit mission, but I think in a future that is a potential to see that block developed. I think there would be interest in it, and so I would like to see that option left open for that particular property. And one of the reasons I like Site 2 and want to reinvest in that area or reinvest our efforts to see it work in that area is because I think a deliverable plan can be achieved almost within the existing footprint of the buildings. So we're taking far less off the tax rolls than we might be in Site 1 in a future where that does become developed. The other issue that is probably even central and more important for all of these things is the general direction and the good faith efforts that have been taking place in downtown over the last couple of years since we made our infrastructure investment, since we started talking about this project. I have seen a flourishing of the entrepreneurial spirit, and I view that particular spirit as kind of a spark. And I think we in government have to be very careful about how we treat that energy and that enthusiasm when it starts to form up in our community. And I believe this decision is going to be a little bit like a cold bucket of water in some respects. I hope not. I really do, but I'm concerned that this move to this other location is going to have some unintended and very difficult to gauge consequences. And I would really like to see us sort of honor the many investments that have taken place and are taking place, and I think in part as a result of our commitment to work in that area and see this project realized. And so I don't want to let go of this site. I think if we were to revisit the project footprint by a little bit, maybe contemplate elements of First Avenue, there is a way to get to a gathering space footprint that meets the HUD requirements, that meets the cost-benefit analysis that HUD is going to demand us to perform, and that ultimately allows us to keep that sort of spark burning in terms of the entrepreneurial spirit, and then also really honoring the significant public input that was a part of this process in the early going. So for those reasons, I'm not going to be supporting the motion today.
Further discussion on the motion?
Mr. Mayor?
Mr. Mayor.
We'll go to Alderman Olson and then to Alderman Straight. Alderman Olson.
Thank you. I think we're overthinking this. It seems like we put a good effort into Site 2. It didn't work. We have a timeline. We need to see if Site 1 is going to work. It may or may not. We don't know. That's, I think, what we're called to do right now. And if it works, wonderful. I think Site 1 could be a gateway to downtown. If it doesn't work, we have to look at Site 3. So, I can empathize with people that made investments. We've put in the time and effort that we have needed to, and we need to move on.
Alderman Straight.
Mr. Mayor, I guess I just wanted to ask something of you, sir. I have great concern about us publicly deciding on Site 1, and as Mr. Zakian had stated about the cost reasonableness question, about reaching out to our large community partner in Trinity Health and then having something down the road pop up from HUD saying, no, if this is the case, we really need you to look at Site 3, and then we have to go back to Trinity and say, oh, I'm sorry, we didn't quite have a better handle of the discussion and the importance of this whole cost reasonableness question. And because the cost reasonableness question has become such a pivotal part of the discussion only recently, I find it somewhat crazy that we wouldn't consider asking or at least inquiring to what a substantial amendment would be, because we received the money as a result of the flood and the devastation of 2011. And as we have to scale back projects because we can and can't afford elements of them, it only stands to reason that we would maybe inquire about, could we have a 1.5 acre gathering space? Because we can't afford to do all of this right now. I'm just curious, sir, if that's at all something that we can maybe flush out before we move forward, because I'm hesitant to move forward, one, because of the public involvement in this project, and two, I really just don't want any more egg on the city's face, because we don't seem to have all these answers flushed out, and I don't necessarily feel like we're learning anything from the process. We're just quickly moving on. And so I'm not supportive, obviously, of Site 1 for issues I've raised all throughout the process. I think the public isn't interested in Site 1. But I wanted to kind of ask you, sir, to lean in a little bit, to maybe get some of this background information, because ultimately I just want to protect the city and how we are viewed in the community as we move forward with this important project.
Thank you, Alderman Wolski. With the substantial amendment, from the discussions that I've had with Mr. Zaki and looking at our process, is if we have not actually gone through the process that we agreed to when we had first, 2016, approved this, that the substantial amendment would be rejected on premise prior to even getting submitted, seeing as we have not gone through this process. On the cost reasonableness side, I think that can be quickly I think, assessed within that first initial discussion with Trinity on whether or not that they would even consider it. And I think that that's the first step on what we have to do within our process, because if we do actually come to the folks at Trinity and say, is it something that is even considerable to purchase that property? If the answer is no, well, then we haven't expended any extra time. Now, if they do say yes, we would at least consider the notion. I think that that's where we take a look at those hard dives, and we haven't lost a substantial amount of time or even any expense at that point. I agree with Alderman Olson at this point. Perhaps we have, in some cases, invested too much emotionally into what it is that had hearts been set on earlier, but we did agree to a process that we're following at this point in time. And certainly those issues that Alderman Straight had brought up will be very closely considered and looked into as we move forward. Any further questions or discussion? Alderman Patagula. Alderman Patagula.
Thank you. This is obviously a challenge. I've never been a great fan of Site 3, particularly because of noise and other issues, but I think for me the key issue is following the rules and the commitments that we made. We've made a good faith effort to try to make Site 2 work, and I think personally, in my opinion, that's the best site for a lot of reasons. It doesn't seem like it's working. We have people who just are not willing to sell, and then there are people who also want a higher price than we judge is reasonable, and that we believe HUD will judge as more than reasonable. So I think the big thing here is to follow through with the commitment as best as we can, and I think that consideration requires us to walk away from Site 2 and move to Site 1. And there's no guarantee that will work, as has been said. Tonight there have been some concerns raised about environmental issues and other issues too, particularly the willingness of the seller. I'm not sure I'd be comfortable with Site 3, to be honest with you, but we're not at that point yet. So this is not something I take pleasure in doing, but I think it has to be done. The other comment I'd like to make is in terms of this comment about us having egg on our faces. I don't think that's the case. And as I cautioned at our last meeting, and I'm really glad that the tone today has been much more measured on everybody's part, I don't think the city has to be embarrassed by this. If there is any egg, it's on the federal government and the complexity of the HUD guidelines and the inflexibility of the government. I think we acted in good faith all along. And it's one of those things where until you get into it, you probably don't really realize what it's going to take. It's like having a child, raising a child, taking a job, moving to another part of the country. Until you're actually there, you really don't know what it's going to be like. And now we're in the midst of dealing with HUD and all these other issues, and I think it's turning out to be much more challenging, much more complicated than anybody ever expected. It's kind of like making a big investment with an out-of-state developer. Until you're in it, you just may not quite know how it's going to work out, and I think that's one of the issues. I don't see us needing to be embarrassed about anything. I don't see us failing in any manner. Sometimes these things work, and sometimes they don't. And I think this is one of those things that's just not working for Site 2. I feel bad about that, but I think that's the reality, and I think we need to move on.
Alderman Straight, did you have a last question or comment?
No, I guess I'm just going to say, Mr. Mayor, that until we flush out the gathering space, I'm offended that we're even talking about moving the money into a different pot. I hate to, add the drama or the emotion that Dr. Padragula doesn't want us to bring to this, but the community is passionate about this because of how we ascertain the money. And I want us to work on the gathering space, whether it's in any of the 3 sites that the public has determined. I'm not a fan of Site 1. I'm not going to vote for Site 1. But until we work on that, let's not start talking about other avenues of where the money might be allocated, because I'm personally offended by that. So I'll leave it at
apologize
that.
for you being offended, Alderman Straight. It was a question, actually, number 4, that maybe got a little deeper than needed from Alderman Wolski to begin with about a funding swap. But it is not being considered. It was simply an answer to a question. Alderman Pittner, you had a comment.
Thank you, Mayor. Just wanted to maybe echo Alderman Padragula's comments, and I find some relief in them to make sure. I was thinking for a while I was in the wrong meeting in the past, because he clarified what I thought to be the case, that we identified sites. Step 1, we gathered input from the public, we negotiated on the preferred site, then we moved to the next site, and then to the next site, and if all of those things don't align and they don't work out, then we come back to the table. We're working through the process. This is the process that we signed our names to. This is a process that we agreed to. At no point in that process did I see that if we don't like the answer we get, we change the rules mid-game. This is the process that we signed up for. And this is a process that we're following. Maybe site number 1 doesn't work out. Maybe site number 3 doesn't work out. Then we come back to the table and we have these discussions again. And just to maybe piggyback off of Alderman Wolski's input, and I agree, it is a valuable site, and I think it'd be a valuable site for a gathering space on Broadway. And like Alderman Olson had said, it could be a gateway to our downtown. It could be a gateway to the investment that's happening downtown. It's next to a parking structure. For if the public doesn't already know that is also hopefully someday developed with retail and commercial space on the main floor. There will be investment in those areas. This is the process that we agreed to. Let's follow through. Let's be men and women of our word and stick to the guidelines that we agreed to. I will support this motion this evening.
Following comments or questions? Please call the roll.
Pittner,
Yes.
Padragula,
Yes.
Straight,
No.
Wolski,
Nope.
Sitma,
Yes.
Janser,
Yes.
Olson.
Yes.
Motion is approved. That does bring an end to section number 8. That also then moves us on to number 9, personal appearances. This is an opportunity for anyone in the audience to come forward and speak on any item that was not on our agenda this evening. Again, an opportunity for anyone to come forward and speak on any item that was not on our agenda. You have that look, Mr. Coughlin. Please come forward and say your name for the record, please, and address.
Mayor Sitma and members of the council, John Coughlin, 605 37th Avenue Southeast. So lately I have not been attending as many city council meetings as I did in my active developing days when both planning commission and council meetings. So been doing that for about 40 plus years. And I will tell you that this is the best city council I have seen in my 40-year career. So congratulations to the council, to the city manager, to the mayor. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Mr. Coughlin. Last chance for public appearances. Seeing none, we'll move on to miscellaneous and discussion items. 10.1, construction activity nuisances. At the request of Alderman Walsky, his email from September 6, 2019, staff has taken a look into addressing the issue from noise and from construction activities that are a concern to him and some citizens. And I'm looking to Alderman Walsky.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, thank you. And thank you to Mr. Jonason, who I think did a look around and request to other cities in the state to see how we address this. This particular issue, construction, particularly noise-related nuisances, has come to me in 3 separate occasions this summer. Once regards and attached to the same property, and once independent of in another location. And in all 3 cases, it's construction-related noise has, I would say, disrupted maybe the quality of life for individuals in this citizen. Let's put it that way, citizens in the community. I completely appreciate the fact that we have a short summer season and we have many, many construction needs, and that it is impossible to make everybody happy at all times. But my larger concerns are construction-related noises taking place outside of times that I would consider reasonable construction hours. All 3 of these issues have complaints related to construction-related noise taking place through the evening or in the early morning hours. That, to me, especially in a residential neighborhood where 2 of these incidents have taken place, is not acceptable. And again, I realize that there are challenges with our particular construction projects, but I think we need to tighten up our ordinance a little bit, which right now has a complete exception for construction-related noises. We do not have any time constraints on those activities, and I think we need to acknowledge the impact that some of these things are having in our community. In one of these instances, this type of an event led to 2 very heated exchanges here at City Hall. I think we maybe even had to bring police in to sort of oversee the encounter that was taking place between, and I was directly related in one of these and in attendance. So I've seen firsthand the impact that these types of circumstances are having on our citizens, and I want us to take some proactive steps to address it. With that said, I would welcome any particular comments on this issue and ideas on how to move this forward.
Alderman Patagula.
I wanted to strongly support what Alderman Walsky has said. The relative quiet is one of the reasons we moved to Minot and we stay here. And I don't think anybody's saying we will disregard the short construction season or anything like that. We're going to have a generation of construction, at least with the flood project. And I think we need to pay attention to this. I really appreciated what Dan Jonason gave us, the brief survey of what other communities do. There were 2 things that jumped out on me on that. First was 3 things. First was the very low level of fines. I think it's $150 for violation. If you're operating a major project, a major construction project or something, that's peanuts. It's not going to deter you at all. So I think re-examining the fine, I think, would be important. Second, it seems like a lot of this is under the jurisdiction and under the purview of the city engineer in terms of granting permits. And that might be the easiest, simplest way, rather than going through a change in the ordinances, is just asking the city engineer to be much, much more careful and maybe set up those kinds of priorities and those kinds of limits. Even with a short construction season, I don't think you have to be working overnight. Now, I did learn about the needing to saw concrete sometimes. Yes, I know that exceptions need to be made for things like that, but I think those should be fairly rare. So an administrative solution might be, or administrative changes might be a big part of this. The third thing that jumped out at me in reading those things was a lot of these are portable generators for major ongoing projects. And what came to my mind is, why can't you run an electric line? We have electric utilities. The idea of running a gasoline or diesel or whatever kind of generator or generators in the communities seems very strange to me when we have very good and very reliable electrical service. And that's one thing I would like to look at very carefully. People set up generators for all sorts of things. We have Excel and we have Verendry. And, I think that's something we should be looking at. Again, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a public works person, but that just immediately jumped out at me. If these are residential areas, they have utilities. And my question is, why aren't we using them? So those are my initial thoughts on this. But again, the bottom line for me is that I think we really do have to pay attention to this. And I don't think the shortness of the construction season should be an excuse for really driving people crazy. And as a psychologist, I know noise scientifically has a major negative impact on people. Thankfully, it's limited in terms of construction. But I think this is something we have to be careful not to let get out of hand. And I think there are times where it's been on the edge, if not past the edge.
Looking at the noise issue, and I'm by no means depreciating the level of which the 3 cases came in. 3 cases, as I've sat here numerous times and said, sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the grease. I've worked construction in in my earlier life in the 4 and 5 a.m. hours where you have to work before the sun comes up and it gets to be 110 degrees. I was also displaced for 3 years at my parents' place across from Washington School, where snows moved at 4 a.m. very loudly by front end loaders because they have to get it moved before the school opens up and the kids come in for the day. Absolutely, I think there's a reasonable place where cause and concern can take place, and some of it can be avoided, but we also do have to absolutely understand that there are going to be circumstances in cases where 24 hours a day has to take place when Mother Nature decides what it's going to do. I think we can all also understand that circumstances in many cases are also changing around, and maybe more specific to the valley with the flood control that is going on. We do have to keep moving forward as fast as we can, and that in some circumstances is going to disrupt some of our lives. I would like to think it's not going to disrupt it more than 2011 did. And I'm going to pause to let that one sink in for a second. It is going to be dusty. There is going to be noise. Trees have been removed to acquire some of the houses along the railroad tracks. We hear them more now through the echo as they are rolling through town, and they are not going to be moving. And it is going to be some time before those levees are built and trees regrow. Outside of the valley, I like the idea of running lines. I'm not sure to where, unless we talk with Excel and have temporary meters put in that would then bill to either the construction company or to the city itself. Certainly, creative ideas can be garnered. I would hate to go in off of a handful of cases, and we did have dust cases. We did have heavy equipment complaints, and then the bridge construction that had the pounding that came in. I'm more than willing to take a look at reasonable processes, but to fully overhaul and put a blanket over it, I would not be in favor of just going in to say that sun up to sundown. And that's just from my experience, not only in the construction, but also down in the valley. Alderman Wolski.
Mr. Mayor, I agree, and I'm not suggesting that we add the heavy hand of government to the challenges that already exist with our construction-related projects. The circumstances here are a generator running outside a home, essentially in their backyard, for 24 hours a day for an extended period of time. In a residential neighborhood, I do not believe that is a circumstance that is reasonable. And so that is among the reasons why this particular agenda item is here. I think Alderman Padragula has offered a very reasonable potential solution, which is in our residential area construction projects, we spec that temporary service be put in as opposed to running generators. And there is a cost to electrical power regardless of whether it's a temporary service or whether it's a generator. There's, I don't know which is going to be more, but I think in circumstances where we are in these types of environments, that might be a construction cost that we simply have to absorb in some form. And so I brought this forward because I think it was worthy of a council discussion. I would like to see us add a little more constraints to the construction noises. I again completely realize that that we want to work early and we sometimes need to work late. And sometimes we even need to work outside the bounds of those restrictions. And that can be done and accomplished by special permit, which is an accommodation that is made in other places. So with that, I would request and I would move that staff take a deeper look at this issue and bring us some proposals that might allow us to address some of these changes, or these concerns, excuse me.
Alderman Walski, do you have a time frame, given
I think
our construction season is coming to an end?
This certainly doesn't need to be in a hurry. I would like to see this sometime early next year, I think. So this could certainly be a 4 or 5 month turnaround.
Any further discussion or questions?
I would also second that. I think, again, the construction season is over, but this is a quality of life issue, and we're going to be facing it forever. And I don't think anybody, at least I'm not, and I don't think Alderman Walski is asking, for no noise. It's not an either-or situation. And I also, the other thing I would mention that's novel, perhaps, is just because people don't complain doesn't mean it's not an issue. People in North Dakota, one of the reasons I live here and moved here, tend to be pretty accepting of things. And I think sometimes we are more accepting of things than we really should be. And I think this is one of those issues. Whether it's, my sense is that there are many more than 3 complaints out there, and I don't think we should be complaint-driven. Part of it should be driven by our sense of what is a good community, and part of it is a reasonably quiet community that offers some flexibility to builders, developers, but also is respectful of people who live here. People try to raise families, people try to have some privacy and quiet and peace on their property. So it's not an either-or situation by any means. And I'd be comfortable actually with a 6-month time frame. I know how heavily worked staff is, but I'd like them to look at that. It's an issue that affects many communities. When I first heard about this from Alderman Walski, I happened to be reading the New York paper. And there was an article about this, an expose about how it's a totally crooked deal and people work all hours of the day and night and they pay off inspectors. We don't have that, thank goodness. But I think it's an issue that many communities face. So I would second Alderman Walski's request that the staff take a good, careful look at this, not a speedy, precipitous look, but a careful look and present us some alternatives.
So we have a motion and a second to have staff take a look at some potential changes to some ordinances on this. Discussion on the motion. The only comment that I have is taking a look at it certainly doesn't hurt. I do also hope that, keeping in mind that we, as we work towards being a more business-friendly community, that those ideals are also kept moving forward. Any further discussion on the motion? Please call the roll.
Wolski?
Yes.
Sitma?
Yes.
Janser?
Yes.
Olson?
Yes.
Hittner?
Yes.
Padragula?
Yes.
Straight?
Yes.
Motion is approved. Our last item for the miscellaneous and discussion items is the historically low treasury bond rate and terms. Alderman Wolski had brought this forward.
I'll introduce it briefly, Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
We see Mr. Lakefield here is already standing here, but this request for an agenda item came from a constituent, and obviously we have some pretty unique circumstances taking place in the larger world economic markets. The Wall Street Journal article that was handed to me referenced century bonds, bonding terms being extended to, in this case, it was higher education institutions for 100 years. I don't know the viability of that for Minot. We're also seeing across the Atlantic negative interest rates. These are weird economic times, let's just put it that way. And so I wanted to bring this forward for a discussion and some comments from Mr. Lakefield about how we're going about ensuring that our larger financial instruments are at the best rates and terms we can find.
Good evening, Mr. Lakefield.
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Wolski, we continue to monitor the markets. Last year, we didn't issue any debt. We don't anticipate issuing any debt for 2019. We actually retired a bond issue early in 2018 with some of our higher interest rate debt. And we also just retired 2 small bond issues here in about the last month or so. Again, some of our higher interest debt that was callable and able to be retired early. So right now, we don't have an immediate need to issue additional debt. And there are some additional complications that come into play if we issue that debt before we anticipate the need to use that debt. So for an example, flood control is the major factor that we know that we're going to have to go to the market and issue debt for coming up. Right now, with the delay in the next phase of flood control, we don't have that need right now at this instant. So if we were to go and borrow a bunch of money in speculation of that need several years down the road, there's a number of other factors that come into play, potential arbitrage issues, all of those types of things too. So there's a lot of different factors that come in. When I reviewed the article that you had sent to me, it had given a rate, I think, of 3.3% on one of those bond issues, but it doesn't say if those bond issues sold at face value or if they sold at a discount or anything like that. It didn't say what the rating was on the agency or the issuing agency. So there was a number of factors that we didn't have in that article. So I don't think we had all of the information that we'd need to really make a comparison. I did reach out to our financial advisor, just to run this by them. And they've kind of been guiding us that even in the flood control, the 20-year term is about the maximum that we would see in the marketplace. We've pushed back a little bit on maybe extending that to 30 years. That's a possibility, but again, it's up to the market and who is buying those bonds as well. And then it's the cost of carrying that debt as well. I looked at just a really quick comparison, and I used a round number, $100 million if you were to finance that at the 3.3% that was in that article for 50 years. And then I compared that to potential legacy fund funding that is being discussed at a rate of about 1.5% for 45 years. And the difference over that term of the debt is about $90 million in additional interest. So it's one of those things, without having more information to make a more detailed comparison, there's just too many unknowns in place. And again, issuing the debt in anticipation of the project, if it was delayed or something like that, then we have a whole nother set of issues and we're paying interest that wouldn't be warranted.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Mayor.
Alderman Wolski.
Dave, I appreciate all your comments, and this is your world, not mine, and so I greatly appreciate your thoughts on all of this. And obviously, my understanding of the efforts we're making for the next legislative session in terms of the legacy fund, the terms and circumstances of that would be my absolute first preference on flood protection under any circumstances, I think, because I would rather see us figure out a way to take North Dakota dollars and turn them back into North Dakota communities rather than going to the outside markets in some other place. I think what this was brought to me in reference to, and maybe had some questions related to, is this an opportune time, or is it even an option for us to, similar to what a homeowner would do with a mortgage, in essence, refinance some of our existing debt? And I don't know that that's available to us or not, and I'm going to take your word for it when you tell us whatever. And if that is an option, is there a circumstance in terms when we reach sort of is there a rate level where we start really taking a look at those types of options?
Mr. Mayor, Alderman Wolski, that is something that we have looked at, and that's why we have retired some of these bond issues early already. It was some of our higher rate debt that we had. Currently, I think the next issue that we have on bonds is callable in 2024 or 2025. So it's at least several years out there before we'd even be able to call those bonds in early. Most of that debt that we have out there is in the high 2 or low 3% range. So then we'd have to do that analysis with what is left on the term of those bonds, the delta in the interest rates, and then, of course, the issuance cost to refinance that money too. So there's a number of factors that come into play. And right now, we don't have that option for any of the debt that we have sitting out there.
Continue.
Yeah. Mr. Mayor, Mr. Lakefield, thank you very much. I appreciate your comments on the circumstances. It's I'm appreciative of hearing it, and I'm grateful that we're keeping an eye on this stuff. Simply wanted to introduce it because this is a circumstance that exists in the market out there, and people are talking about it. So I think it's healthy for us to have these discussions here.
Thank you, Dave. The interesting thing when we were at League of Cities, Alderman Wolski, is that several other communities in North Dakota were talking about doing exactly what you just described, and they were actually calling some of that higher debt in. And thankfully, with I think the last couple of years, we were able to even be ahead of the curve of what's going on now. So, any further discussion on this item? If not, that takes us to the end of our agenda, and I would look for a motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion by Alderman Pittner, second by Alderman Wolski. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. We're adjourned.